Hello and welcome to Lutherans Alive. My name is Gregory Held, and this is the program that brings you the story of Lutheran Christians and their ministries in southwestern Pennsylvania. With us today is Pastor Linda Theophilus, pastor of Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Eastmont in the Penn Hills section of Pittsburgh, and I'm also a member of the Church and Society Committee of the Southwestern Pennsylvania Synod. Pastor Linda, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here today.
It's good to have you here and to have a chance to be brought up to date, as well as to provide some good, solid background on immigration services, the refugee status, and to make some of the connections between the biblical story or stories and our understanding of refugees and its place in the church, refugee settlement, hospitality. Yeah. There are a lot of interrelated issues here, aren't there?
There are lots of interrelated issues, yes.
Yeah. Maybe we could just start by having you give us a little bit of background about where you are as a pastor at Emmanuel and how you developed this interest in refugee resettlement, refugee issues, and that area of social ministry.
The interest in refugee resettlement and in just welcoming people from different countries, that just developed as I went through life, and the experiences that I had being able to attend a high school overseas with kids from all over the world. Also, my home congregation resettled a family from Laos, and that was around 1980 when they came. Okay. So I got a lot of exposure that way. When I came to Emmanuel, there wasn't anything in particular going on. But as I attended global mission events, the national events in the church, I kept meeting staff from Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. So that's how I got involved at this stage in my career.
Mm-hmm. And you do it regularly enough that you were associated with the title ambassador.
Yes.
The church had or I guess they may still have remnants of that formal kind of a relationship where there will be people who take a direct interest and who agree to be kind of point person in an area of the church to raise awareness, to put the consciousness out there for other folks to be alerted about what's going on and what the needs are.
And also to receive training from Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service so that we're able to accurately represent what's happening for refugee resettlement and for other areas of immigration issues.
Mm-hmm. Let's kind of try to take a little bit of a chronological approach to today's program. You mentioned coming prepared to talk a little bit at least about the biblical stories and how we can identify with some of those stories and the current situations that we deal with on a daily basis here in the United States.
That would be fine. And I want to preface this by saying that Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service is a national agency. It is a cooperative ministry of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and the Latvian Lutheran Church in the United States.
Interesting.
And then they work through social service agencies in refugee resettlement and also as a resource for congregations in their ministries. So that's a little background. We don't have any of our Lutheran social ministry agencies locally doing refugee resettlement. But nationally, that's a big interest for us. And Lutheran congregations here have been getting involved through the local agencies that do have the contracts with the government. So that's how we do it locally.
So then what biblical stories would you point to help have people have some understanding or to make some connections with that?
Some of the words that we talk about today, I mean, refugee is someone who's fled persecution, and there's a legal definition. In the Bible, examples of this would be Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus when they fled from King Herod. And because they fled on their own without going through any kind of screening beforehand, they didn't have an invitation to come to Egypt. They just picked up in the middle of the night and fled for their lives. They perfectly meet the criteria and the definition today for an asylum seeker or an asylee after you've been granted that status. So they're a perfect example of that. Another example would be an economic migrant, someone who leaves for economic reasons, sometimes just to further their own well-being. But often the biblical stories are people who feel that they're forced into it, like the story of Naomi and Ruth. When Naomi and her husband and her sons left Bethlehem, it was a time of drought. They went to Moab because they needed food. And that's the story of a lot of migrants today, especially those who went to the United States without permission and frequently are called illegal immigrants. But the Bible stories that parallel their lives are the stories of people like Naomi and her family. Now, a family reunification story would then be Naomi going back to Bethlehem years later with her daughter-in-law Ruth. And Ruth becomes the immigrant, now the new person, the foreigner in Bethlehem. And she's come to be with her mother-in-law, family.
I see.
You also have forced migrants who are sold into slavery. So we're talking about people being trafficked. Well, the story of Joseph, who is the son of Jacob, whose brothers sell him to the traveling Amalekites, and then he's taken to Egypt and sold as a slave. He'd be today called someone who's been trafficked. There's some other examples we could use too, but that's a pretty good basic starter point.
So these aren't things that are only happening today and haven't happened before. And perhaps we, living in a somewhat or more or less stable society compared to many of the smaller countries around the world or third world countries who experience these things in a much more real way every day.
Yeah.
We hear about them from a distance or learn of them as we're influenced by people who are coming here.
Sure.
But the actual situations that, as you say, are told in the biblical stories are still being played out every day in people's lives.
And the Bible is full of so many stories. Almost every person in the Bible, they move from one place to another. Some are crossing boundaries, national boundaries, and others aren't. But there's a lot of movement.
I guess looking at the biblical stories, the nation of Israel is kind of a little more unique than most in terms of having its borders changed, being at a crossroads of civilization and having a lot of different people coming and asserting their authority over them. They experienced it in a very different way, but many of the individual experiences are the same.
A lot of the refugee resettlement work that Lutherans have become involved in, and not just Lutherans, but in the United States, the refugee resettlement work really got organized in the wake of World War II. And at that point, obviously, there were many people who were displaced in Europe, not to mention the Jews who had experienced such persecution. At that point, 1 in 10 Lutherans was a refugee. It's a few generations back for some of us now, but not for everybody. There are many people who are still members of the Lutheran Church and our partner denominations who that was their life story.
I have just a couple of personal anecdotes that I could probably contribute to that conversation. We do have to take a break for just a couple of seconds. When we come back, let's pick up on that thought and continue our conversation.
Thank you.